Hi, everybody. My name is Kevin Freeman. Welcome to York History Group. Today is September 5th, 2021. Our topic today is religion in early York, and the complexity and conflict is today's topic. My special guest today is Danny Bottino, and Danny is a very familiar face to anybody who's a history buff in the town of York, I am certain. And so I always love having Danny come on. He's such a, he's just, his knowledge is extensive. I love picking his brain, probably to the point of where Danny becomes unnerved at some points. But nonetheless, I get to pick his brain here today, and we've sort of outlined what we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about sort of like early Catholicism transforming into, maybe we're going to talk about Lutheranism, and then we're going to come to how the Puritans came over and the early churches in the town of York, and how far we get depends on how much time we have. But before we do that, I thought it would be interesting for Danny to share with us a little bit about his Ph.D. pursuit. And what, Danny, welcome to the show. And what tell us a little bit about what your inspiration was to pursue a Ph.D. in early, and tell us what the dissertation is about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Definitely. Yeah, I can talk for a little bit about that. In the fifth year, just starting the fifth year of my current PhD program. So that means I'm in the actual writing process. PhDs usually about 300 pages long. Sometimes, much longer, several hundred pages. You can write as much as you want, really. So it's the writing process is a pretty arduous one, and you have quite a lot. I'm going to have quite a lot that I know I'm going to have to say. So it's difficult, really, to summarize history PhDs down into a short package, but I will try. My overall PhD topic is 17th century English history. Is what it started out with. I was fascinated by the sort of what's called the landscape history, which is, so a landscape is more than just what the physical land looks like or is. The landscape is how humans create a culture out of the landscape in which they live in. So just to give you the difference between the physical land and then the cultural landscape. Let's say there's an old oak tree. So that's just what it is. It's an old oak tree. And then in terms of the cultural landscape, let's say that there was someone buried under that tree, or that the tree was marked as a boundary marker, or as a place where people in the town meet, or some great speech was once held under that tree. These moments in human history then would create memories. And so people then pass by that tree, or they come to that tree and they think of the fact that something happened here. Whether or not that really happened, of course, myth is a major part of this. And so that tree then is more than just a physical tree in a spot on the map. It is a part of the landscape of the people who live in that area and who know that tree's there, and who know the fact that there's someone buried under that tree, or something happened. Whether recently or whether in the deep past, mythical past. And so that's what I focused on, trying to understand how people in the 17th century, in 17th century England, thought about this, and how they created landscapes and how they created memory in the process of doing this.
And so
Yes.
give a sense of entitlement, I think.
What's that?
Did that also provide them a sense of entitlement? So when
Right.
you go by these
Right.
features continuously, you feel a sense of belonging.
Yes.
To a geographic location, which you might not otherwise feel that.
Right. Yes. It's certainly a major usage of these humanly created landscapes was a sense of ownership and a sense of place in that this is our home, and these landscape monuments and marks are the proof of the fact that we live here, that we have lived here in the past. And of course, on a more micro level, in terms of property ownership, there, boundary markers are the primary, are the most notable in terms of markers in the landscape to prove the fact, or to try to prove the fact that, yes, this is the property of a certain person. This is where my property goes. And also, if the boundary markers are old, then that proves that the long tenure of the fact that this has been owned for centuries, right? Which makes the claim to the land in the present day stronger. And in many cases, especially in terms of mythical memory, these were fraudulent claims, or perhaps we could say tenuous, in that they were not grounded upon certain fact. A village, in order to prove that a certain area of land was their property or within the bounds of their village, would create, perhaps subconsciously, perhaps consciously, a myth to say, the patron saint of our parish, say, was at this place, and she left a mark here in the land. This proves that this is part of our parish, not part of a different parish. This may not have actually happened, but it was created within the memory of the people to show their claim. And oftentimes you have different memories coming into conflict too. So you have lords claiming a certain boundary, and then you have peasants claiming a different boundary, or claiming rights that the lord says that the peasant doesn't have. And then they use sites in the landscape to prove their ancient rights, or memory of certain rights.
So
yes.
So Danny, is this a field of study you're interested in for a little kid?
Oh yes, I would say definitely. This overall theme that I've been sketching here, I've been fascinated by since I was really young. Just growing up in Kittery Point, in a forested area. I did a lot of walking through the forest. My dad showed me the paths. We made paths in the forest, which of course only we knew where they were. They're not well made paths. So but they're useful. So if you bring someone in the forest, it looks to them as if it's just a wilderness. But then you point out, no, the path is here, and only then do they see it. So this started me thinking about, how do humans create a sort of a lived-in area out of the land that they work in, or live in general. And of course, my dad told me about the history of the land too. That the forest that we walked around in, that we worked in, had been cleared once, and sheep had once been grazing here, and that's why there were so many stone walls, which seems strange. But these were stone walls to mark boundaries and to keep sheep from going into other areas. And of course, it's all forest now. So it got me to thinking about who was here in the past, and how they've marked the land, and how the memories of these farmers, these former farmers, all we have left of them are these stone walls that they've built. So it got me to thinking about how powerful the memory in the landscape is, and that's, in some ways, it's the only way for us to learn about who was there in the past and what their lives were like.
Yeah. Are you hearing when I talk? I'm still getting an echo.
I don't hear any echo when you're talking.
Okay, I hear it. I'm going to turn my volume down a little bit here. And so, Danny, you shared some of this with me earlier, and
Yes.
you told me about the features, and as you go by them, they start to it reinforces your sense of place and stuff. And I was in the middle of creating a memoir of my early childhood with my early childhood best friend, and it's a very short memoir. It's like 50 pages, but once I was in the middle of it, and when you told me about this way of looking at things, I had like the realization, as I kept writing, that I could connect all of these things, and it really enhanced my memory in a way that I had never anticipated.
Yeah.
And it made me feel like that it also it reminded me that the landscape doesn't really do anything other than just be itself. And it
Yep.
doesn't give you back any memory. You're the person that carries the memory and,
Yep.
And the history that you've been told. But the landscape is just really distorted. It's this thing that just stays almost like stagnant. It's evolving all the time. The miracle of
Yes.
nature is like amazing, but it's not willing to provide us anything in return other than what it's going to offer us. So for example, like the childhood school that I attended in Cape Medic, it's been removed. And every time I go by there, I remember myself playing on the playground. I remember the school doors. I remember the kids in the classrooms, but there is no indication that that was ever there.
Right.
And so it's almost like it can give you that sense of place, but it can also sort of like leave you with an empty feeling of a sense of place, with the exception of just your memories.
Right.
So that's taken you all the way to your PhD thesis.
Yes.
Which is really amazing.
Definitely, yeah. The main twist to what I'm doing in my PhD, which I think really makes it something different and helps it stand out from previous work which has been done in this field, which there has been quite a bit actually, is that I'm looking at the early Maine history too, which of course I've always been fascinated by my local history. Growing up in this area, learning about the history of the towns, and of Maine in general. And then I realized that I could bring this into my previous work, which I did in my previous studies, master's. And when I was starting my PhD, I said, well, I can make a trans-regional, as it's called, study, English history with what was the landscape like for 17th century English people. And then what landscape concepts did they bring with them to early Maine, right? Yeah. And the key question is, how did this culture that they brought with them, how did that factor in to how they lived in early Maine, and how they tried to settle, and how they tried to create towns, and how they chose to interact with the native people who were already here, who had similar but also slightly more similar than what people think, but definitely different in many key ways, understanding of property ownership and memory, and what the landscape of Maine meant for them. And the key argument is that the English people who came to early Maine were primarily rooted in an oral culture. Most of them couldn't read, most of them couldn't write. Even for those who could, there wasn't much paper. As for actual printed paper, there was no printing press in Maine probably until the end of the 1600s. So there was certainly no printing going on. There are probably a few printed books which came from Boston or London, but this was primarily a culture of the oral, of the spoken word, and of memory of the spoken word, rather than memory through the written word. And that is how property was claimed, and that is how the landscape was thought of. And in many ways, this was a culture which gave power to the oral word over the written word. So in some cases, which I'm finding, you have conflict between someone who has a written deed to a certain property and someone who has a different memory of the ownership based on a memory of a oral deal which took place. And if that went to court, usually the oral memory would be the dominant one. And so the native people of Maine who were dealing and trading, and of course later on 1600s fighting with these early English towns, also operated within a primarily oral culture. And so it's that mapped them out, and that they were able to figure out what was going on in terms of land deals and trade very early on. There's this stereotype, which is that the early English towns operated, the early English towns, when they were buying land from native people or trading with them, wrote everything down and were completely literate, and that the natives, not being able to read English and coming from an oral culture, were tricked and they were helpless. And this was the cause of their fall, which in early Maine certainly is completely the wrong way to look at it. That did not happen. And that's a fundamental argument I'm going to be making in my PhD.
So once you have your thesis, will you make that available eventually?
It should be, yeah. I would like it to be, certainly. Most history PhDs, you can access digital versions of. Rutgers hopefully will make mine a free digital file for people to look at. I would like for as many scholars as possible to have my source so they can cite it, and for just anyone who wants to read it, hopefully you'll be able to.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to it.
Excellent.
Okay, so now we'll move on to part 2 of our conversation.
Yes.
So, and that is going to entail a little bit about the history of religion in Europe, almost more modern Europe, starting with like Henry VIII.
Yep.
Yeah, and how that, and Danny, something that really fascinates me is, religion seems to play a role of creating a group of people to become submissive, I guess, or reliant on a hierarchy. And I think that, and when I think about it, it's kind of like, I think that might be the singular role of it, but it takes two to play. It takes two, and so I'm really curious how this has how that religion was so popular, and how the people were so manipulated. But people do need to believe in things. I understand.
Yes.
So I don't want to discount that aspect of religion, because I feel like I'm a very spiritual person myself.
Right.
I spend a lot of time trying to be attuned to that. But at the same time, the just the blindsiding that went on, and especially like we know the Catholic Church, up until the time of Henry VIII, and then what with the exclusion of England. How did it's like, yeah, so you can walk us through this. What was the process that landed the Puritans here?
Yeah,
and
right.
What they brought with them as a lesson, I guess.
Yeah, right. How did these English Protestants come to Boston and to early Maine also? Yeah.
Yeah.
And why did they come? Just like I mean, in terms of the spiritual world of these people, 17th century people in general, certainly spirituality was intertwined with everything that they did. Catholics, Protestants, it was the dominant force in the average person's life in ways that are completely different from how most or almost everyone lives in the current time. And it's difficult for scholars or for anyone studying the this period, 1600s and certainly earlier periods, to comprehend that difference. And there has been an argument within scholarly circles about just how deep that goes, and the fundamental question of, was it possible to be a modern atheist, right? Someone who is absolutely or almost totally certain that God is not real. And there certainly were atheists in the modern sense by the 18th century. But many scholars, I believe that the dominant viewpoint is that most scholars think that prior to the 18th century within Europe, it wasn't possible just within the culture of the time period to be a modern atheist in terms of being absolutely certain that God wasn't real. This was just something that was not culturally possible. Yeah. Now, of course, you could time travel back to the 17th century and perhaps bring some of those people to the 21st century and they might be atheists if they live within our culture for 20 years. But in terms of the 70th century, it probably wasn't possible. So that just shows you how different the world was that these people are operating with it.
Yeah. Let me just briefly have a mess. I'm looking at our Facebook feed here, and Jen Goodwin says, seems as though they took sovereignty and people scrambled for something. Yeah. So somebody claims that they're sovereign. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what sovereignty means too, to different people, I guess.
Yeah. We can talk about that, certainly. Yeah.
And also, I just want to say that we are recording this, and we are watching our Facebook live feed here. And if anybody has any questions you'd like to ask Danny, I'll try to get them to him as well as I can field them to him.
Yes.
So
certainly. So I'll keep going what I was saying there. Almost done. So within Europe, the big sort of spiritual watershed that leads to the spiritual world of the Protestants who come to settle Maine in the early 70th century is the break with the Catholic Church in the 1530s. So Henry is the king, and he in 1509 he becomes king, and he famously has 7 wives, so that's what he's mostly known for today. But of course, it's the marriage issue which leads to his break from the church. And as many people know, his first wife, Catherine, Spanish, did not have any male children, and ultimately it was clear that she wouldn't have any more children. So he wanted to marry a second wife, Anne, hopefully hoping to have children with her. He may have loved her also, is what he claimed. But the church, the Catholic Church, wouldn't recognize that his first marriage was not valid. And so he simply broke with the church for political reasons, right? And from Henry's personal life, it seems pretty clear that he was a pious person. He was very strongly tied to the customs and the ritual actions of the church, Catholic Church. He didn't want to change any of it. He simply wanted to be the head of the church. He wanted to have absolute power over what he thought was his kingdom. And he thought that if there were churches within his kingdom, he should have absolute power over them, not a distant pope. So it was that break, which was made for practical purposes, one could argue, which then opened the door to the rise of Protestant doctrines. And Henry was not happy about that because he didn't want to change doctrine. He just wanted to change the status of power. But of course, if the Pope is no longer in charge of the church, then that means that Protestants can now come in, which happened, and then start changing the doctrine of the church in ways that they saw fit.
And Danny, so did they retain some of the Catholic doctrines?
Right. Of course, as Protestant Christians, there are basic Christian doctrines, of course, that they couldn't just throw out. The fact that
Christ himself.
Right. Yeah. Right. They couldn't throw out Christ. Right. There's basic doctrines that make you Christian.
But things
Trinity,
like communion,
of course.
Things like communion, they could fudge around a little bit.
Yes, right. There were certain doctrines that were really fought over because these were things that you can change in certain ways without completely changing the Christian faith.
Yeah.
And these were the doctrines that were really fought over by different Protestant factions, right?
Yeah.
And so it's this fighting within the Protestant church that causes people ultimately in the early 1600s be so fed up with it that they just leave and they come to settle Boston. And
so can we
Plymouth.
Can we back up just a little bit to maybe Martin Luther and Calvin?
Right. Right.
Was that happening at the same time that Henry VIII was having his revelation? Okay.
Yes. Which made it possible for him to split. So you have Calvin and then Luther, of course, is the man who makes the first break, the first major break, lasting break with the church. And then you have people following in his footsteps afterwards, Calvin being the most prominent one and the one most notable for our history that we're talking about here. And so you have Luther breaking with the church in the 1520s, which of course Henry is looking at, and I would say makes it possible for him to break from the church in the 1530s. Although he doesn't like Luther's, he doesn't like Luther as a man. He doesn't like Luther's doctrines either.
Well, Luther, and let's be clear, Luther was a Catholic priest.
Of course, exactly, yes. So Luther started out as a Catholic priest, and then broke from the church, yes. Although, as Luther would say, and this is a critical aspect that most Protestants, Lutherans, and then other Protestant sects would claim, and many, of course, still do, is that not that Luther broke from the Catholic Church, but that the Catholic Church had lost its status as the true church. And so Luther, until he died, claimed that he was still a member of the true Catholic Church.
I see.
And claimed that he had never left, and that, in fact, he had only taught the true doctrines, which most people, not everyone, but most people in the church had lost. Calvin, of course, also claimed that. And so Calvin's doctrine is what we're going to focus on here. Okay. So Calvin is French, and he's born a little bit younger. I believe he's born in the early 1500s, maybe late 1400s. I'll have to check that. And he teaches. He starts out as Catholic also. He may have been a Catholic priest too. I'll have to check that. And his fundamental teaching is that God is, of course, all powerful, and for God, time doesn't matter. Time is something humans have to deal with, but for God, as being all-knowing, of course, he knows everything has happened, everything that will happen. And so then this means then that God already knows whether he has saved people or whether he has damned people, because he's already done that.
Wow.
Right. So that is a difficult teaching. Luther somewhat shared that, but he didn't want to really make it a dominant. He didn't want to make it a big part of his teaching because it was rather scary. But Calvin was absolutely certain of it, and he made this. He saw that if this was true for him, it seemed that this should be a dominant factor in people's lives of the pious Christian. And so this means that everyone living has already been judged, has already been saved or not been saved. And so for Calvin, then, the life of the pious Christian should be lived in a very wary manner, knowing that, one has already been judged.
But you know what judgment is?
Right. So that's the key. That's the key question. Is it possible for humans to know in their earthly lives? And for most Calvinists, the answer seems to be that the most pious people, if you have been saved, there would be signs that God is showing favor on you. Your business would do well. You would have quite a lot of children. You'd be generally happy. And these would be good signs that you had been saved. And so you should live your life in a sort of a searching mode, looking for signs that you have been saved. Mm-hmm. And these signs will give you confidence. And maybe, as you're reaching the end of your life, you will have a very high level of confidence that you have been saved. But for most people would not be able to find these signs and to know. And this, of course, the correlate to this doctrine is that Calvin preached this certainly, and many of his followers did, that most people have been damned. 9 out of 10, maybe more.
Was it a class distinction?
Certainly, yes. I would say that within English Calvinistic culture, the people, the godly people, as they termed themselves, the people who were confident that they had been saved, were of higher status. And this is one of the reasons why they are confident that they had been saved. And there was a tendency probably to look at poorer people, to look at lower status people and say that they haven't been saved and God has not shown favor to them. And this is true for family lines too. Whether you're from a high status family, this was a sign that God has favored your family. This would break down in the 1700s, but in the 1600s, this was the dominant thought within Calvinism.
So Puritanism splintered off from Calvinism?
Right. Well, Puritans are Calvinists.
Okay.
They are they are English Calvinists. Right. So this is where it gets complicated. English Calvinists who want to purify the English Protestant church. And so, as I mentioned, the church is formed when the king breaks from the Catholic Church. And by the end of the 1500s, Calvinists are the dominant faction within the church. So most bishops and most of the powerful leaders of the church are Calvinists. And so there's no need to purify the church because the church is already mostly pure. Of course, it could always be more pure in most of these people's eyes. But there was no need to purify it because they were the dominant faction. By the early 1600s, you have bishops, and the King Charles also are sort of anti-Calvinists, right? These are people who argue for the free will doctrine, which is the fundamental tenet of Calvinism, that people don't have free will. There are people who start thinking about this, and they think that this is somewhat strange and wrong and dangerous, right? Because it will lead people, if you think about it, it could lead some Protestants, and it certainly did lead some Protestants to start thinking that if I've already been judged, then what's the point of trying to live morally, right?
Exactly.
I could sin as much as I want to. And there were some people who actually did that, who actually argued that. And so you have a faction coming to power in the church, English church in the early 1600s, saying we should stop preaching this doctrine because it's leading people to either not care about living moral lives or to be so stressed out and worried that they're just miserable, which was also happening. And also because this doctrine is just wrong and that God gave people free will, as it states in the Bible. And how could Jesus, this was the fundamental argument that these men made, how could Jesus have died to save everyone if at the moment that Jesus died, God had already, as Calvinists argued, God had already prejudged everyone? If Jesus died to save everyone, but God had already damned people, 1,000 years in the future, then Jesus didn't die to save for everyone. Didn't die to save everyone, which should be a fundamental Christian teaching. So there were people arguing that, the king certainly.
Yeah, and at the same time, the Bible was evolving.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming that from Catholicism, they had a Bible that they were referencing. The Pope had one. Martin Luther was working on his own. And then somebody printed the first English version.
Yes, the English Bible.
And
right.
Was that Charles or was it James? It was King James.
It was Henry who ordered the first Bible, the first English Bible to be printed.
Okay.
And it was King James, the first, who ordered the best, as it was then viewed, the best version of the Bible.
Right. So we can assume
the King James Bible.
We can assume that was cherry picked.
Well, okay, yes. That's a good question, because in the Bible that the English Church was using in the 1500s, if you look at it, Calvin, I believe, ordered that Bible to be made.
Okay.
Or at least followers of Calvin, right? Yeah, it was English-speaking followers of Calvin who translated that Bible in the 1500s. And if you look at it, there are notes everywhere. There are little notes in the margins, and these are all very Calvinistic notes. So you have a verse in the Bible, and then you have the note, which was added by the people who translated the Bible, stating that what this means in terms of Calvin's doctrine. So, and the King James Bible left those notes out, but of course, it's still translated the Bible. And it's only so much you can do when you're translating the Bible from the language that it was written in to tweak it to fit your doctrine. But Calvinists certainly did this. They did.
I guess I'd take exception. There isn't only so much you can do. They were audacious.
Well, yeah. I mean, certainly, certainly, you have the language that the Bible was written in, which is what it is.
Yeah.
And then you have to translate that into a foreign language, right? Yeah. And so you can't completely translate it wrongly. I mean, you could, but then Catholics would, call you out on it, or vice versa, right? So you have to be sort of subtle.
So Anglicanism was sort of like the umbrella of all of these Christian religions.
Yeah. Well, the English Anglican Protestant Church claimed to be, the true Catholic Church, as all Protestant churches did. And so there was the fight within the church as to what doctrine they would follow: Calvinists versus the free will Protestants. That was the major fight. Yeah. And the question was, who would win? Yeah.
So I didn't want to. I'm sorry to interrupt you because you were.
Oh no.
So we're getting up. I'm waiting for the crossing over the Puritans over. But you were talking about the Puritans are Calvinists.
Puritans are Calvinists, yes. Okay. And so this is what I was saying. I was trying to get to it. Is that the Puritans were losing the battle in the English church in the early 1600s, and that the free will doctrine people had taken over most of the powerful seats within the church. Bishops were no longer mostly the bishops were mostly followers of the free will version.
Okay.
And they also were more in favor of ritual actions. Calvinists, of course, viewed, didn't think of ritual as a way to get to, as a way to be saved. So in terms of the, altar, in terms of the actions of the priest, the clothing that the priest wore, Calvinists said we don't need any of that. Within the English church, the bishops were saying we do need that. That is useful.
So communion at one time was actually people thought they were drinking some aspect of the blood of Christ.
Okay. Yes. That's a key. Yeah. That's a key aspect.
Okay, you take over from there.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's a major Protestant Catholic. That was a major argument. And what the bread and the wine actually is during the church service, whether it truly transforms into the real body, into Christ's actual body, which is what the Catholic Church argued and still argues. Now, Luther also argued that. Luther looked at the Bible, and Jesus says at the Last Supper, "This is my body." And for Luther, this meant that the bread and the wine was his body. And for other Protestants, it didn't seem logical to them that the bread and the wine was really Jesus's body.
So it was a symbol.
It was a symbol
aspect that you were talking about. Okay.
It was a symbol. Yeah. Calvin certainly viewed it as a symbol.
Yeah.
Within the English Protestant Church in the early 1600s, there was a growing number of people who were more willing to view it as more than just a symbol, as a substance of magical properties, rather than just bread and just wine, and perhaps even Christ's body, or something magical or mystical was happening there. Whereas for the average Calvinist, this was in no way Jesus's body. And so if you have ritual, which is meant to make the bread and the wine is meant to make it seem as if it's a magical substance. So, certain ritual actions, wearing certain clothes, placing it on a fancy altar, right? These are things that Calvinists would say shouldn't be done because it's just bread and it's just wine. So this angered them quite a bit, and there were quite a few battles over that. The major battle was over the will, whether the will was free or whether the will was bound by God. That was the main argument.
But
there were other.
Are we getting ready now to make the crossing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, I still want a little bit more. I'd also like to just tell people, I think that Danny and I are trying to keep this to like under an hour. And we think that this could be like a 3-part thing. So I really just love the details, Danny. And I'm really grateful that you're sharing all of this. And I hope I'm not asking too many questions. But because so anyways, so if we're gonna say goodbye in about 10 minutes, I think. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna resume at another date, and we're gonna continue this discussion, because I don't know if we can really get up into three generations of ministers in York.
Which I certainly want to do, but we are at the point where we have people leaving England to come to settle Plymouth and Boston and Maine and many other areas. And this is the reason why, for these Calvinists within the English church, they were dominant. And now they're being, as they see it, punished. They're being forced out of the church. And they want to purify the church. So that's where their name Puritan comes from. And by the 1630s, 1620s, 1630s, some of them are starting to think that they can't win. They will never have power in the church. The primary reason for that is that the King, Charles, is not a fan of them. So the king is using his power to fight you and to stop you from gaining power in the church. That's something certainly that will make you lose hope that you'll ever win. So these people start thinking, maybe we should leave. Maybe we should go to the New World. Plymouth, of course, is founded by people thinking along these lines in 1620. These are the most radical Calvinists. These are Calvinists.
What about Jamestown? What was happening?
Jamestown, right. Jamestown is different. And early Maine is some aspects in which is similar to Jamestown, some aspects in which is similar to the Plymouth colony, Boston colony. And that Jamestown is seen as purely purely for business purposes in terms of its founding. Of course, there's the sense that we're sending good English Protestants over to hopefully spread the Protestant gospel in the New World. And of course, there's the Catholic Spanish have been there for 100 years, and the Catholic French also. And so there's the worry that the natives will be joining the Catholic Church, or that the Pope will have power over this whole world, this whole new continent, which is just terrible. So that's a motive, but the primary motive of the Jamestown world is making money, the Jamestown venture, which they don't make money really there until like 20 or 30 years after Jamestown is founded. But they are sponsored by the king and the English government. It's not people trying to leave, the government of the king or the church. Whereas Plymouth and Boston certainly is. They still recognize the king, but they know that it takes three months for a ship to cross over. They know that they're not really under the power of the king or the church, and so they can do what they want in their own churches. Plymouth Pilgrims certainly they went to Holland first because they in the early 1600s because they did not even recognize the English church as a true church in any way. They did not want to work within the system anymore, right? And so they said, we are our own church, and we don't want to be in England where they can persecute us. And so they went to Holland, and then they were worried they were getting too Dutch and that their English culture would be lost. So they wanted their own colony. That happened with the Plymouth colony, Boston colony, certainly. the Boston colony is a little bit different in that Puritans Boston is founded in 1629, 1630. Puritans, this is founded by more moderate Puritans who were still trying to work within the English church, still trying to change the church, still recognize the overall English church as a true church, but just as a church that they thought really needed to be changed. And they thought the best way to do that would be to leave their home country where the bishops were not happy with them, where the king was not happy, where they didn't feel as if they could work to change the church. They wanted to go to a distant land where they could set up the pure church as they saw it. And then once they did that, then they could come back to their home country and triumph. So that was the Boston colonies.
So they think that they were somewhat autonomous unto themselves.
Yeah.
Boston versus even Plymouth, were they're both doing their own thing separately?
Yes. So these were two separate colonies, definitely.
Yeah. So can I just change the subject a little bit? And when I think about religion today, it plays such a minor role in most people's lives.
Right.
Back then, this was a primary concept. This was something that it was primary in their day-to-day lives. And so it meant like religion was so much more defining to them. It was so much more demanding of them. And it seems like they just spent a lot more time trying to figure all of these nuances out and develop.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And so when we're talking about it, if we think of it in today's term, well, whatever, they're probably on their cell phones and they're just having a good time. But here we are. I'm looking back at this going, wow, they didn't really have a lot else to do. Maybe they were drinking beer probably.
Oh, yeah.
But they were really focused on this primary aspect of their life, which was religion. And it was also a big part of their community.
Oh, yeah.
And it was reinforced in that community. And when the hierarchy or the monarchs of Europe were running things, they were really taking advantage, I think, of the peasantry. And then, but now all of a sudden we have these people coming over here who are businessmen and merchants and whatnot, and seem to have some of them have pretty good means of livelihood.
Yeah.
And now they are governing themselves in a way where they don't have this king overshadowing them.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons why we broke the British settlements, colonies broke from Britain in the 1760s, 70s, 70s is because the king and the king's government, parliament, had more active power over the colonies than the government had ever had, because it was easier for ships to cross the sea, and the government was more powerful. So the colonists were not used to that. I mean, the colonists throughout the 17th century, in most cases, were living without the British government as a direct power in their daily lives and within the lives of the government. Yeah. And so they were living without the king's government. And when the king started to say, "You are the colonies of my country, of my kingdom, I should have power to tax you, I should have power to govern you," this was something new for the colonies in the 1770s, 60s. Wow. Which in many ways shocked them and made them think that the king was a tyrant, because he was doing things that he had never done, because he simply didn't have the power to. Wow.
So I think that we're getting into the next part. And we're gonna start talking about York, and
yes,
it's right at the turn of the hour, and we said we'd probably terminate right now. But how about if we go a little bit farther into what's now, we do transition into York, and maybe talk a little bit about Dummer or Burdett or
Burdett, certainly.
And then before we get before, we won't get too much into it, and then we'll end today's segment, and then we'll resume on what we'll call part 2.
Yeah, I'll give a little teaser for what we're going to talk about next time.
All right.
Just talk about how does early Maine fit into what I've been talking about here.
Yeah.
Gorges, Ferdinando Gorges is the preeminent character that we have to think about in terms of how English people first came to early Maine. Ferdinando Gorges is a very prominent, very, very powerful merchant, very wealthy merchant from Plymouth, England, which is Western England. And he becomes fascinated in settling Maine as early as the early 1600s. So he sponsors a voyage to settle Maine, send English people to colonize Maine in 1607, which is sort of a sister colony to the Jamestown colony in the South. So the plan was to settle a colony in Jamestown in the South and in Maine in the North, Popham colony. The governor of the colony was George Popham. And the Popham colony just simply left. They built a ship and sailed back because it was too cold for them. The native people did not want to trade with them because previous English captains to the area had treated them very poorly. And the bugs, they were not used to the bugs, which were biting them. And so for these three reasons, they just couldn't take it, and they built a ship and sailed back. So Gorges's first Maine venture failed, but he kept doing it, and he was eventually able to settle English people along the coast of southern Maine by the 1630s. So this was modern day Kittery, York, Wells, and Casco, which is here in the modern day Portland. And Gorges was willing for anyone to come over. And of course, there were people who came over for purely business purposes, just people who wanted to fish or to build mills, to cut timber. Those were the two primary businesses. And there were probably, ordinary Anglicans, mostly, just moderate Protestants, we would call them. And then there were probably radical Protestants too, who came over to early Maine because they could see that they could make money there, and they weren't happy with the fact that the English government was not leading the church in the right way as they saw it. So there was in early Maine probably a mixture of various spiritual types or sects within the English Protestant church. Yeah. And Gorges was willing to send anyone because he just wanted to colonize Maine.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, the French were north, still in Maine.
And of course, yes, the French are at the same time.
So they weren't very far away, and they were very influential down here.
Oh, yes, definitely. We'll be talking about that because you have the Catholic presence of the French in the north who also claim Maine. Yeah. And
but primarily the influx of English people.
Yes.
They felt confident that this was British territory, or it was hard. They're welcome here. And whereas were there Lutherans immigrating here? Or
it was, as far as I could tell, in the early days, 1630s, 1640s. Maybe a few Scottish people, but mostly English, almost all English.
And the Scottish people weren't probably coming from their free will.
Right. Most of the early Scots here were Scottish people captured in the Civil Wars, prisoners in the 1650s. Yeah. There may have been a few Scots earlier than that, but probably not. Most of the people came were certainly English, and they were all Protestants of various types. Within the English church, some radical Calvinists, some almost Catholic types, and most people probably were just moderate Protestants. But it's hard to tell really, because we don't have the personal sources of most of these people. We don't have their diaries or their letters. We just have the fact that they were here and where they came from. Yeah. So it's very hard to tell. But one of the ways that we can get a more intimate glimpse into what church life and what spiritual life was for people, this we'll talk about next time, is Gorges sent his cousin Thomas over in 1640 to be the governor. And so we have the letters that he wrote back in this book here. He talks about his own spiritual life and about what the spiritual outlook of York and of early Maine, of which he was the governor, was as he saw it in the early 1640s. This is the first source that we have, which gives us a really detailed glimpse into the spiritual lives of early Maine English people.
Wow. So, and that's fully transcribed?
Yes, yes.
Wow, that's a treasure.
It's a great source, yes.
Wow.
So I'll be talking about that next time.
So one of our most pious residents, is he mentioned there, Mr. Burdett?
Yes, so he is a major figure in the letters. And he is, yes, most pious. We will see.
So we could just leave it there because
Yeah.
you know, I'm really anxious, eager to get to the submission also, but we can just keep
Yes.
going on. We can make this a 3 or 4 hour discussion. So I think that we'll wrap things up now, and I'm really looking forward to continuing on to part 2 as soon as we get together and we set up a date. How's that sound?
Definitely. All right. Yes, I'm looking forward to it. Yes.
Yeah. And so we just want to encourage everybody to join us next time, and thank you all for joining us this time. I'm Kevin Freeman. This is Danny Bottino, and we do I think, speaking of myself, I recommend that everybody supports local history.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so you just hold on there, Danny. We're going to exit Facebook, and have a great afternoon, everybody.